And as most people say on these talks, that they are not an expert in what they're talking about, and just add me to that list. But we're going to look at William Gurnall, the Remainer. Now, about 25 years ago, my late wife and myself, I think Matthew was with us, we went down to see the in-laws, as you have to do, and we ended up at Lavenham Church, where William Gurnall was pastor for 35 years. And I was standing by the font talking to two people about the church. I'd never been there before, but I was giving them a long discussion about the church and its architecture and that kind of thing. And then we got on to 1662. And I was talking to these two people. I was conscious of a crowd of people gathering around the back of me. And I can honestly say that it was in Lavenham that I learnt the secret of open-air preaching. Just speak to two people, don't take your eyes off them, and let the crowd gather around you. Now, the main source of Gurnall's story is a very detailed account written by J.C. Ryle. J.C. Ryle, as you remember, was the first Bishop of Liverpool, and I'm hoping to go up there in a few weeks to go and have a look round Liverpool. But of course the cathedral was built after he had finished there, because his concern was ministry and not buildings. And I regard J.C. Ryle as a colleague in the ministry, because before he went to Liverpool and one or two other churches he went to, he was minister at Stradbroke in Suffolk. And I was the minister at Laxfield, about 5 miles away. And of course you're going to ask yourself this question, well, did we see each other? But of course not, there was 100 years between us. But I'm grateful to Ryle for his detailed account of the life of William Gurnall. But Ryle didn't write it from his own research, because most of what Ryle had said comes from a writing by a Mr. McKeon, who was a Lavenham parishioner, and who wrote this long-titled book, An Inquiry into the Birthplace, Parentage, Life and Writings of the Reverend William Gurnall, formerly Rector of Lavenham in Suffolk and author of The Christian in Complete Armour. And that book was published in 1830. So very simply tonight, I want to do three things. One, look at key points in Gurnall's life, and that will be Lynn, King's Lynn, Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and Lavenham. The second area, which is the most interesting bit, is why he was a Remainer and not a Brexiteer, because of the 1662 Act of Uniformity. And then a very, very brief look at this tome that he is known for, The Christian in Complete Armour, 1,200 pages on 11 verses of Scripture. The armour in Ephesians chapter 6. And this is the only book that Gurnall actually wrote. And probably, if it wasn't for 1662, that he was a Remainer, we may not even have heard about him anyway. So, we all like data, don't we? So, Gurnall was born in King's Lynn, or it used to be called Lynn in those days, in 1616. Like most children, or every child really, he was baptised in St Margaret's Church, the parish church on the 17th of November 1616. His parents were married in the same church on the previous New Year's Eve. His father was an alderman of the town. And if you think of a town council, you've got your councillors and you've got the higher level of aldermen, the ones that used to wear their Nelson's hat the wrong way round. And he was mayor in 1624. Now, we don't know very much about his father, except that he did own some land at Walpole, just outside of Lynn, not the one in Suffolk, and obviously that indicated that he had quite a bit of wealth. His father died in 1631 when Gurnall was just 15, and his mother remarried soon afterwards. So he knew all the trials and stresses of home, particularly that my father died when I was 14. In fact, today is the anniversary of his death. And all the things that go on in a home, a household, Gurnall had to face. He was educated at the Free Grammar School in Lynn. As you know, education in those days was very much based on the church, on foundations, on endowments, and it wasn't until the 19th century when education became more stabilised throughout the country. And in 1632, he went to Emmanuel College, Cambridge. Now, it's quite probable that the seeds of Puritanism were already sown in Gurnall's mind before the age of 16. Now, let us never forget how impressionable young people are. And it's the impressions they get which is the most important thing, isn't it? And I suggest to you 3 reasons why Puritanism became so important to Gurnall even at that young age. 3 reasons. 1, during the time of Mary, Elizabeth, the Stuarts and the Commonwealth, Norfolk and Suffolk was renowned for its allegiance to Reformed theology, to Puritanism. The doctrines of the Reformation meant much in this part of England. And contrary, the High Church, Anglo-Catholicism, High Church is really Catholicism in an Anglican setting, was despised. But the interesting thing was, although East Anglia, with these 2 counties only, forgetting the others for a moment, even though that was the situation, there were 3 Norwich bishops who were totally against Puritanism: Wren, Montague, Harsnett. But clearly, Gurnall must have picked up something from this background in church life. The second reason is that there was a man called John Arrowsmith, and he was a leading member of the Westminster Assembly. And he was minister in Lynn for a time, and he certainly was a Puritan, because he wouldn't have been at the Westminster Assembly, obviously, if he wasn't. Now, the Westminster Assembly met between 1643 and 1653. The majority of the members were Presbyterian, and their job was to restructure the Church of England. And they wanted to bring it closer to the Church of Scotland. Now, there were Baptists there were Congregationals there were obviously Anglican, Presbyterian, the lot, but the majority were Presbyterian. And the outcome was that they were going to make the Church of England Presbyterian. No bishops. The Presbyterianism was going to be the key thing. It was agreed. But when Charles II returned in 1660, that all changed. It reverted back to the Church of England with bishops. It became an Episcopalian church once again. And that really is the background to what happens leading up to 1662. The third reason is that there was a man called Samuel Fairclough who was a lecturer at Lynn from 1619. Now, a lecturer was a common term for a regular preacher in a parish church, but not the rector or the vicar. And so if you went to church on a Sunday, you might hear the rector preach, or you might hear the lecturer preach. And he was a Puritan, but he was forced to resign because of the opposition of one of those three bishops, Harsnet. So already there were influences on Gurnall's mind leading up to the time when he went to Emmanuel College in 1632 at the age of 16. He entered Emmanuel as a pensioner, but he was only 16 years of age. Now, we know in this country that in time you'll be retiring at about 80, the way government policy is being introduced. But he was a pensioner at 16. And it was very simple, because the other word for pensioner is a commoner. If you went to college as a commoner, it meant that you paid your own fees and your own living expenses. Now, I know most students today, they have to pay anyway, or mum and dad pays, or even grandparents pay. But if you paid your own way, you were a commoner. And he had a scholarship from the Lynn Corporation. And probably because of the influence of his father as an alderman, but I would like to think more because of his academic ability, and that did prove to be the case, that he was there, he won the scholarship for justifiable reasons. It wasn't just a question because his dad was one of the aldermen of the town, but because he had earned the right to receive a scholarship to go to that college. Little is known of this period regarding Gurnall, except as Oxbridge goes, you get your BA first of all, and then you come back and pay your money, and you get your master's degree. Sorry if anybody here went to Oxford or Cambridge, but that's how it happens, certainly today. So by 1639, he was finished with Cambridge, and again, we know very little about him after that point. Now, Emmanuel was famous for its Puritan theology. Lots of Puritans attended that college, and many of their books probably adorn our shelves. Matthew Paul, I've got the 3 volumes. Thomas Watson, his Body of Divinity, his 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and so on. Jeremiah Burroughs, Thomas Hooker, Stephen Charnock, John Cotton. But don't forget, they're only 16. But they were there. And can you imagine the discussion and the debates and the prayer that went on between these people? Many of them were contemporary with Gurnall. But you see, the wonderful thing, this is providence, isn't it? Thank God for providence. that God was already preparing key players for subsequent years. That's why if we have any influence over children, whether as parents, as grandparents, as friends of people that have got children, as teachers, as medical profession, whatever influence we have over children, we must give them good impressions. Because there's so much awful stuff out there that's moulding the minds of young people. And certainly Gurnall and his friends had a lot of good influences. The headlines in Cambridge newspapers at that time would have been, because of the background of church and state matters, would have been words like discontent, murmuring, controversy, bitterness, party spirit. Things were not happy in the church. As Ryle says in his biography, the suicidal, blind misgovernment of Charles I was rapidly paving the way for the destruction of the throne. What Charles was doing to the nation, Archbishop Laud, with his Roman tendencies and bitter persecutions, was doing to the church. The inevitable breakup of church and state was on its way. Fuller's History of Cambridge tells us of a Mr. Bernard. He was a lecturer of a London church, but he was invited to preach in St. Mary's, Cambridge, condemning these current trends of an increasing Roman influence upon the church. And he preached on 1 Samuel 4 and verse 21, "The glory is departed from Israel." And he said quite openly in his sermon that whatever Rome says, there can be no salvation without repentance. And he said any ordinances adulterated by man, for example, the communion, they were no longer God's ordinances. And he said that Pelagian error reflected in the ceremonies and rituals of the church. And one of the aspects of Pelagian's thinking was that man had the ability to believe. Man could do things to earn salvation. And it's like when you see people going to, say, communion and ceremonies in the church, that they feel as if they're gaining brownie points because they've done it. They can now go home and please themselves. And yet the whole point of particularly the communion service is that we might come together to reflect upon the death of our Lord Jesus Christ and know that we are feeding upon Christ for all things. But to see it as a brownie point calculator, the more I do it, the more I'm saved. That's Pelagianism. Well, the Vice-Chancellor of Emmanuel, or the Master as they're called, complained to Archbishop Laud, and Bernard was called upon to say he renounces those teachings. But he refused, and consequently he was imprisoned, where he later died. Now, as you know, undergraduates tend to sympathise with those who are vulnerable, the persecuted, and so on, but certainly not the university hierarchy. Strange, isn't it? It was a Puritan college, and yet the hierarchy was against Puritan thinking. It was also during Gurnall's time in Cambridge that folk like Prynne, Baswick and Burton published alleged libels on the Church of England. And they were sentenced by the infamous Star Chamber to be condemned to the pillory and have their ears cut off. Anyone in Cambridge at that time would realise that these were confusing days with conflicting opinions, and even the Puritans were not always perfect men. Well, he left Cambridge in 1639 and he was installed at Lavenham in 1644, but we don't know what he did in between. Some think he went to Sudbury for a time, and he may well have been in the church in Sudbury. His ordination is interesting because we don't know how he came to this decision to be a pastor of a church. And there's three possible answers. One is that he was never ordained at all, and I'll explain that in a minute. Secondly, it's doubtful he was ordained by a bishop because, one, there are no records to say in Norwich and Ely that he was on the list of those who were ordained, but he was ordained after the Act, or he was ordained by the hands of the presbytery. And it seems likely that he was ordained by the laying on of hands of the presbytery, because, as I say, there was such a confused time that we're in that the Presbyterians still had tremendous influence, obviously, in the churches. Now, the way a minister was chosen is rather interesting, because today, most denominations are pretty strict over who they have to be their ministers. I know I had a friend who wanted to be a Methodist minister, and she had a choice between becoming a Methodist minister or marrying an Anglican priest. And she decided to marry the Anglican priest instead. But she said the rigmarole for Methodism was far worse than the Church of England. But in those days it was quite simple. If a congregation liked you, they would call you, and it was then approved by Parliament without any regards to archbishop or bishop. So ordination may not even come on the agenda. There were no church courts, there was no wearing of vestments, and even no regard to the Book of Common Prayer. So these certainly were interesting days. I remember when I was teaching RE at Yarmouth High School, I did start off at Blythe Jecks actually in 1983, because I spent a number of years teaching RE in state schools, that when we used to take the youngsters down to Yarmouth Parish Church, we were told that at one time there were 3 congregations meeting in that building, not at the same time. There were the Independents, the Presbyterians and the Anglicans. But you imagine them all coming at the same time, got the time wrong, and they all turn up together. So he was 28 when he went to Lavenham in December 1644, and he served for 35 years. The patron was a Sir Simon Jews. He gave the parish to Gurnall at the request of the parishioners, so he was obviously well liked. The appointment was approved by Parliament, and Gurnall is described as being very learned. We've seen that already. Very godly man. How we need godly pastors today. And quite orthodox. That's interesting, isn't it? Quite orthodox. He was appointed for life, as rectors and vicars were in those days, not today where you have to go at 70 or whatever. He could receive all the due tithes from the land, but of course he must pay the first fruits and tithes to the king. Now, why Gurnall settles in Lavenham is unknown, but Ryle tells us that there was a certain James Gurnall living in the town in 1644 who had a daughter baptised there in the same year. Maybe it was the Gurnall link. The De Veres, now don't get him mixed up with To the Manor Born. The De Veres were the chief family of Lavenham. I knew one of the De Veres when I was at Sybil Headingham, my first church, because I was near Castle Headingham. And there was a Miss Magendy who lived in the castle. She used to run a scout group where the scouts still wore the big hats and shorts. And that was about 20 years after everything changed in the scout movement. But she was a relative of the De Veres, and she was certainly someone to be, don't get too close. Lavenham was a very valuable living. It was worth £850 a year. That was a lot of money in those days. There was 140 acres of glebe land attached to the rectory. Gurnall would have been very well off, and there wouldn't have been any need for absent livings. That meant that if a vicar or rector went to a parish and there wasn't enough money for him, he would pay a curate to stay there and do all his work and probably pay him less than the minimum wage. And then he would go off and find a very rich parish and live there and just make the occasional visit back to the original parish. This was quite common when men only had little incomes in some churches. The church building is dated late 15th century, early 16th century, paid for by the De Veres, and it's described in White's History of Suffolk as the finest building in Suffolk. 1645, he married Sarah Mott, the daughter of the Vicar of Stoke by Nayland. They had 10 children, 8 of whom were living at his death. So no problem with the Sunday school, no problem with the church choir. This shows his wealth, that so many survived, because death was normally through poor diet or disease. But they had a good life. In 1662, he signed the Act of Uniformity. From 1662, little again is known about Gurnall in Lavenham, except that he was very earnest, faithful to his preaching, faithful to his pastoral care, as well as having 10 children to look after. There are some letters, extant letters that we have, which were written either by Gurnall or to Gurnall. And most of them were problems that parishioners had. And so what you did, remember that very few people could write in a parish. Perhaps the vicar and the squire were the only two that could read and write. And so one of your jobs was to write letters for people in your parish. And one of them is a reply from Gurnall to request to preach in the House of Commons. But he declined because of his health and the lengthy journey. But it does show that even at that point, he was held in high regard as a preacher. This faithful pastor died on my birthday in 1679. But his will was written the day before. And as you know, a will is deemed to have been written at the moment you die. And the opening paragraph says, he writes, "Weak of body, but thanks be to God, of sound mind and memory, resigning up my soul in the first place into the hands of God, my Lord, Redeemer and Saviour." So, some highlights from Gurnall's life. So, why was he a Remainer? Why was he a Remainer? Well, 1662 Act of Uniformity was not the first time that there was a mass exodus from the church. Following James I's accession, Puritans would not accept the changes, and 300 of them were forced from their livings. It's impossible to have an accurate number of how many left in 1662, or because of 1662. Because some had left before 1662. Some had left in 1662 but did not conform, but did come back later. And some, surprisingly, were ejected from their churches, but guess what? They carried on preaching in their churches. And the popular number is 2,000, but according to A.G. Matthews, it was possibly 1,760, which was 20% of the total clergy in the Church of England. And there were also university lecturers who were kicked out as well. So it was not an insignificant number. Almost all were Puritan. Most were Presbyterian. Some were even Baptist. Can you imagine that? And Bray said it was the expulsion of Puritanism from the national church. So the restoration of the monarchy came with a promise. Charles II promised that the state church would be broad enough to accommodate the Puritans. Of the 2,000 that left, we'll keep to that number, most would have stayed for a few concessions. They had no objection to bishops and were happy to accept the prayer book. But the ruling party wanted the Puritans out, and the Act of Uniformity was the means to do it. Archbishop Sheldon was asked, would many Puritans remain in the church? His reply, I'm afraid they will. So the Act was to bind church and state relationships by using the ministers. It was to affirm the supremacy of the monarch in church matters. It was to impose total acceptance of the prayer book. But funnily enough, it was only published a few weeks before the closing date for signing to stay in, 20th of August 1662, and most men were unable to see it. And it was to make sure that all men, all pastors, were ordained by a bishop, if not done previously. So, people's reasons for leaving. Ministers who did leave did so for conscience sake with good reasons. The issues were clear. The Reformation, started with Luther, had not gone far enough. The line had now been crossed, and it meant hardship. Leaving your parish, leaving your stipend, leaving your comfortable home to an unknown future. But it was essential for truth and conscience sake. And all they could say was, we rest in God's hand. Now, there is a false assumption about the Anglican Church at that time, that all men were in fact Anglican, because we've seen that clearly this was not the case. Many of them were Presbyterian. And so for some, it was the excuse to go. And that's very different by saying that every one of them was an Anglican and there was a free choice. For some, this gave them the golden opportunity to leave the state church and its bishops, to go their own way. So what about the Remainers? Why did some men such as Gurnall, who shared Puritan convictions and whose presence would anger men like Sheldon, decide to remain as many did. Some may have said, I've had enough of all this. This has been going on too long, this confusion. Let's stay where I am. Others might have said, I'm in it to win it. As people say today when they're faced with a challenge in their particular denomination, they say, no, I've got to stick it out. I've got to stick it out. We're going to win one day. Others may have said, I've always been an Anglican. Well, we know that Gurnall was baptised in the Anglican Church, and he had been in Anglicanism all his life, but obviously many of them weren't. They were Presbyterian in their thinking. Others might have said, let's make a good job out of a bad one. It's better to put up with things we don't like than to throw away opportunities of service. Probably there was no one reason why these people stayed. But regarding Gurnall, I'm going to suggest to you that there were two reasons why he decided to stay, even though the majority around him actually went. But I want to put this into a context, a wider context. Controversy is never far from church life, whether within a local church or a group of churches. And I want to mention very briefly three particular things. In 1887, there was a downgrade controversy. Spurgeon resigned from the Baptist Union as he was convinced that the Union was moving away from its historic biblical roots. He left, and he was an influential member of the Union. Archibald Brown, who was his successor at Spurgeon's tabernacle for a short time, but had enjoyed a very flourishing ministry at East London Tabernacle that some of you may know, he remained. And he, of course, was the father of Douglas Brown, the minister that came to Lowestoft in 1921 when the Lowestoft revival broke out. And if you haven't heard Matthew's talk, sign up afterwards to hear it. Spurgeon went, others stayed. In 1971, Michael Taylor was the principal of the Northern Baptist College, stood in Westminster Chapel pulpit at a BU assembly, and I was there, I heard all this, and he said that Jesus was no more an animal than us. He publicly denied the virgin birth of our precious Saviour. Many men left the Union after that, but equally many stayed. I remember being at the inaugural meeting of the Association of Evangelical Baptist Churches soon after, and this group had been formed. It gave itself a 10-year lifespan, and then they thought by then most churches would have settled into groups like the FIC or the EFCC if they wanted to move a little bit wider. But clearly some left and some remained. In recent times, the Church of Scotland and the Scottish Episcopal Church have voted for same-sex marriage. Some have already left from the Church of Scotland because of that. But equally, others have stayed. And there's always been an ongoing journey for many people within Anglican things over the ordination of women, gender issues, including same-sex marriage, and so on. And over the years, many clergy have resigned because of personal conflict with the very infrastructure of Anglicanism over bishops? Are they area people, or is an elder a leader in a local church? They disagree with infant baptism. Sorry, Congregationalists. And church order, because of the themes that we've just mentioned. Many have done that. Remember Herbert Carson, a well-known Anglican. He came out because of infant baptism, and he became a very prominent leader in the free churches in the 70s and 80s. And if you look in the FIEC handbook, the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches, the last one I think was published about 2008, there are a number of men in FIEC churches now. Guess where they started their ministry? In the Church of England. But they came out, they were trained at Oak Hill and all the evangelical colleges, but they felt enough's enough. We need to leave. But some faithfully continue. John Stott and Martin Lloyd-Jones had great debates over the nature of the church. I remember a comment being made that the doctor said once in a meeting that we agree on everything, but not the church. But some stay, some go. So for these men in 1662 must have been a very difficult decision for any man to make. Whether you left or stayed, differences of opinion would have divided clergy loyalties, church congregations, college fraternities, and family bonds. So what about Gurnall? Well, there was family tension, wasn't there? Because his father-in-law at Stoke-by-Nayland left. It's easy to throw at Gurnall, well, you've got a large family, you've got a good income, you've got a nice house, your health's not very good, too much to lose. Criticised by others. He was criticised, marginalised, vivified even. He was the subject of an awful book written about him. He was in the minority. And where he was surrounded by all these Puritans that were leaving, but he appeared to be the only one that was going to remain. John Owen, he began his ministry at Fordham and Congregational. He left there in 1650. He would have known Gurnall. Stephen Marshall, again a member of the Westminster Assembly, was minister in Wethersfield and Finchingfield, but lived in Ipswich until 1655. Matthew Newbecome at Dedham, Thomas Young, Stowmarket, Daniel Rogers, Wethersfield, William Sparrow of Halstead, next to Sybil Hedingham where I was, Stephen Scandrett in Haverhill. All these men were in close proximity to Gurnall. They all went. But Gurnall remained. So, why do we think he remained? Something interesting happened the day after the 20th of August, when the last day had come for signing up to the Act. The 21st of August, Gurnall was ordained by Reynolds, the Bishop of Norwich. And on the 22nd of August, his position at Lavenham was confirmed. Remember, he's already been there 18 years. So would a man rush into something like that unless he had thought carefully about the decision that he had made? So what are the two reasons I'm suggesting to you tonight why Gurnall remained? I'm going to say the first one, and I follow Ryle on this, but the second one is not quite Ryle. The first one is this: gospel loyalty to a bishop. Bishop Reynolds of Norwich was a Puritan, and Gurnall obviously saw him, in an old phrase, like a father in God. He must have dealt with his decision he's got to make. He must have dealt with the anguish it was causing him, the tension in his home. Can you imagine his wife, what she would have said to him, knowing that they were going against her father? It was gospel loyalty to a bishop. In fact, Ryle says that Gurnall would have gone out of Lavenham Rectory and followed his father-in-law, Mr. Mott, in succession if the occupier of Norwich Palace had been any other bishop than Reynolds. There's good evidence for that. There's good evidence for that. But this is the reason I love, and it's this. He was 21 years of being a pastor up to 1662. He'd already proved himself to be a faithful pastor and preacher. And if his magnum opus is anything to go by, he was a pastoral preacher. He was a pastor teacher in the light of Ephesians 4, verse 11. It's not pastor and teacher, it's pastor teacher. So what was more important to him, leaving his congregation as a shepherdless flock to an unknown future, possibly in the grip of hungry wolves? Or would he continue as a cure of souls? That wonderful phrase you find in the ordination service in the Book of Common Prayer. I would argue that the issues at stake fell far short of his preaching and pastoral concerns. Yes, it was the question of the lesser of two evils, but he had a long-established work, and he was not willing to let his flock scatter into an unknown future. He was a pastor. He was a pastor, and good pastors, good shepherds, are not willing to give up their charges. So for Gurnall, it was the decision to remain pastor of Lavenham Church. That's the key word, pastor. To leave with the crowd would have taken as much courage as staying. To have stayed took even greater courage than going. But to stay as an individual would have demanded a responsibility to serve his flock that he had loved so much and served so well. Gurnall's world was as uncertain as our own. Debates drew as many different viewpoints as there are people. We might disagree with him on his decision to remain, as we might identify with those who left. However, it was his decision, no doubt made with great anxiety, much discussion, fervent prayer. He had his reasons. We must leave it there. But whatever his chosen pathway, he remained faithful to his God and to his people. That's what makes a true pastor. Not church politics, not personal attitudes, not seeking celebrity status. We have plenty of that. But he was the very opposite. But in prayer book language, he was a cure of souls. Very briefly, and it will be very brief, on the Christian in complete armour. Apart from 2 sermons preached on special occasions, the Christian in complete armour is Gurnall's only published work. But what a work, and how well remembered it is. John Owen has given us his 16 volumes, Thomas Watson his books, Sibbs, Bunyan and the like. 1,200 pages Gurnall gives us. written over a number of years between 1655 and 1662, and simply an exposition of Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 20. There are 3 volumes originally produced and published. And the book outlines the Christian's battle against Satan and his angels, and how the Christian is to be adequately prepared for that battle. It came out of his pastor-teacher work. They were printed to complement his week-by-week ministry. And you know, I've got a hunch that C.H. Spurgeon got his idea for the sword and trowel from Gurnall. Now, what have people said about Gurnall's tome? John Newton said, "If I might read only one book beside the Bible, I would choose the Christian in complete armour." Somebody else said, "I began reading this book as a Sunday read, and thus it took me almost 2 years to finish it. I look forward to every moment I spent with this book. Gurnall's words are profound, convicting, encouraging, and comforting. I've often resorted to it," Spurgeon said, "when my own fire has been burning low, and I have seldom failed to find a glowing coal upon Gurnall's hearth." But if you want something a bit simpler, not simple, take this one. Daily readings from the Christian in complete armour. And there's a daily reading for every day. This should be required reading for all Christians. It is theologically heavy in some areas, so it can be used more as a reference tool than for reading cover to cover, full of practical advice for the Christian battles in life. A few observations about the book in general. Its scope and comprehensiveness covers the entire Christian life. It's amazing what is in there. I've not read it all through, I'll be honest with you. I would call it a secondary title, a manual for Christian living. If you want to know what it's like to live as a Christian, turn to Gurnall. The illustrations are often taken from the author's own experiences. There's references to the sea, to sailors, to ships, to the army. He knew the perils of the Wash. He knew the Norfolk countryside, the Norfolk sands. He knew Lincolnshire. There are comparisons between his experiences and spiritual lessons. And to quote Ryle, it is full of golden sentences. Just a couple of examples. If you ask a fisherman why he stands with his hook in the water all night, he will tell you it is because he enjoys fishing. Now, you know why God waits for sinners months and years, preaching to them. He delights in forgiving them by his grace and mercy. The workmanship of heaven and earth gave God the name of Creator. There is no greater evidence of God's mercy than his plan of redemption. All his other majestic works will flow as rivers into this one mighty sea, on whose shores the saints will stand at last. Letting Satan crack his whip over man is one way God punishes rebellion. Satan is an overseer given in God's wrath. What better way to infect the whole town, that's the thought of Lynn, than to poison the cistern where they draw their water? If Satan can wiggle into a passer's heart, then he is free to roam amongst God's flock undetected. Christians should daily pray. Prayer is not a holiday but a daily work. And he that closes his eyes at night without praying lies down before his bed is made. He's like a foolish captain in a garrison who takes himself to his rest before he has set the watch for the city's safety. In his introduction, he describes days of affliction and suffering as being the evil days. But these days, he says, cannot be avoided. But there is adequate resource to deal with those needs. And so you have wonderful themes like the Christian courage and resolution, Christian strength lies in the Lord, faith in God's power, temptation, holiness, what each piece of armour is and means and how we are to use it, the preeminence of faith, how Satan hinders prayer, importance of public prayer, extraordinary seasons of prayer, our demeanour during public worship. It's all there. It's all there. Why ministers are called ambassadors. Every age, friends, is a battleground for the Christian. We may face different foes, but Satan remains the same. Some Christians have little understanding of his deceit and wickedness. Others see him under every bed. Read Gurnall. I commend him to you, not only when you read Ephesians 6, but whenever you think of any aspect of the Christian life that you're concerned about. It's all here. It's all here. If I was on Desert Island Disc, and for my choice of a luxury apart from the Bible and Shakespeare, I would choose Gurnall, for hopefully it will help me to become a complete Christian, not perfect, but thoroughly equipped for every good work. Thank you.